The horn sounded twice before I understood what it meant. 2 blasts meant a beast had slipped its handler. On the ceremonial hunting grounds of my father's estate, that should never happen. Every creature released for a royal hunt was drugged calm, chained, and watched by 3 separate guards. 2 blasts meant someone had planned for it to happen. I turned toward the tree line, where my husband stood alone, unarmed, admiring a cluster of blue flowering vines, as if he had not a single enemy in the world. Around us, 40 nobles of my father's court went still. I saw Counselor Vantor's mouth twitch, just slightly at the corner. He looked away too quickly. My husband's name was Daniel Ashford. He was the son of a human ambassador, and I had been married to him 4 months earlier as the final seal on a treaty between my people and his. I did not choose him. I had not even met him until the week before our binding ceremony. What I knew of him fit on a single page: quiet, polite, unremarkable in every way that mattered to a warrior culture like mine. He did not spar. He avoided the blade dances expected of every consort in my father's house. When the court hunted, he watched from the sidelines with the diplomats and the elderly, sipping tea while real warriors tested themselves against dangerous game. I had married what I believed to be the safest, softest creature in this alliance. And now something enormous was crashing through the undergrowth directly toward him, and he had not even turned around. Let me explain who I am, because it matters to what happened next. My name is Seraith, daughter of General Kest, ruler of the Ilvain Dominion. Among my people, worth is measured in scars and victories. A noble who cannot defend themselves is not a noble at all. When the treaty with the humans was signed, my father needed a way to bind our 2 peoples together so deeply that neither side could easily break it. A marriage was the oldest solution his advisors could offer, and I was the obvious candidate, being unmarried and of an age considered suitable. I was told the humans were a young species, technologically behind us in almost every visible way. Their ships were slower, their weapons cruder, their cities smaller. My father's court whispered that we were doing them a great favor by accepting one of their sons into our bloodline. I believed it, because everyone around me believed it, and because Daniel gave me no reason to think otherwise. On the day we met, he bowed to me with careful, formal politeness and said very little. He had pale eyes and dark hair, and he stood a full head shorter than most of my father's guards. When I asked him what skills he brought to our house, he said quite plainly that he was good at listening and not particularly good at anything else worth mentioning. My attendants laughed about it later, gently, the way you laugh about a harmless thing. I did not laugh unkindly. I simply stopped thinking about him at all. For 4 months, our marriage was a matter of shared meals and separate lives. He attended council sessions as an observer. He wrote letters to his family on Earth. He walked the gardens alone in the evenings, always unarmed, always calm, always careful never to draw attention to himself. I began to think of him the way one thinks of furniture that has always been in a room, present, unremarkable, easy to forget. There were others in my father's court who did not forget him so easily. Counselor Vantor led a faction that had opposed the treaty from its very first reading. He believed, loudly and often, that binding our bloodline to a lesser species was an insult to everything the Ilvain Dominion had built across 1,000 years of conquest and discipline. He had allies among the older houses, families who remembered a time before humans were even known to exist beyond their own solar system. To men like Vantor, my marriage was not a diplomatic victory. It was a wound that needed to be reopened and shown to the public until the alliance collapsed under its own shame. I did not know, on the morning of the royal hunt, that Vantor had spent weeks arranging exactly this moment. The hunt was meant to be simple. Twice a year, my father's court gathered on the eastern grounds to test young warriors against carefully managed game, creatures bred for size and aggression, but controlled enough that no one of noble blood was ever truly at risk. Daniel had been invited, as consorts always were, to stand at the edge of the field and observe. No one expected him to hunt. No one expected him to do anything at all except stand quietly and admire the trees, which is precisely what he was doing when the second horn blast tore through the morning air. I remember the sound the creature made before I saw it. A low, rolling growl, deeper than anything a properly restrained beast should be capable of making. Then the underbrush split apart, and a Larask burst into the clearing, its shoulders alone taller than a grown man, its hide the color of wet stone, its claws already dark with the blood of whatever handler had failed to stop it in time. A Larask loose and unchained was not something my people hunted for sport. It was something we hunted to survive, and it was moving in a straight, deliberate line toward the one member of the court who carried no weapon and had never once demonstrated any skill with his hands. I called his name. I do not remember deciding to do it. The word simply left me, torn out by something faster than thought. Around me, guards were already drawing their blades, but they were 40 paces away, too far, too slow, and every instinct trained into me since childhood told me that what was about to happen could not be stopped in time. Daniel turned, not with panic, not with the wide, frozen stare of prey. He turned the way a man turns when he hears his name called across a quiet room, mildly curious, unhurried. He looked at the Larask, closing the distance between them with the calm attention of someone reading a weather report. Then his hand moved to his side, and for the first time in 4 months of marriage, I saw that he had been wearing something beneath the folds of his diplomatic robes all along. A blade, plain and unadorned, without a single decorative mark to announce its owner's house or rank. It should not have been there. Consorts were not permitted to carry weapons during ceremonial functions. He drew it anyway, in a single motion so quick and so quiet that half the court did not register it had happened until the creature was already falling. I have watched 1,000 duels in my father's arena. I have seen champions trained from birth to hold a blade, warriors whose entire lives were built around the moment of the strike. I had never seen anything move the way Daniel moved in that clearing. There was no wasted motion, no flourish, no display for the watching nobles. He stepped once, turned his shoulder into the creature's charge instead of away from it, and the blade found exactly the place it needed to find. The Larask's momentum carried it past him and down into the grass, and then the clearing was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. Daniel straightened his robes, wiped the blade clean against a fold of cloth he produced from somewhere I could not see, and slid it back into its hidden place at his side, as though he had done nothing more remarkable than swat away an insect. 40 nobles stood frozen at the edge of that field. I was one of them. He looked toward me, and for just a moment, something flickered behind those pale eyes. Something that was not the calm politeness he wore like a second robe. Then it was gone, tucked away as neatly as the blade, and he offered me the same careful bow he had given me on the day we met. "Are you unharmed, my lady?" he asked, as though he had not just moved faster than any warrior in my father's court. I did not answer him right away. I was too busy trying to understand what I had just seen, and more than that, trying to understand how thoroughly I had misjudged the man I had been married to for 4 months, without ever once looking closely enough to notice. Behind us, I heard Counselor Vantor's voice rise above the murmuring crowd, sharp with something that sounded almost like anger, though I did not yet understand why a man who claimed no stake in my husband's safety should sound so furious that he had survived. "The beast handlers will answer for this failure," Vantor announced, striding forward with his robes gathered in one fist. His eyes moved from the dead Larask to Daniel and back again, and for just a moment his composure slipped enough that I saw something calculating beneath it. A grave failure. I will see the handlers, questioned myself. My father's chief guard, a broad woman named Orissa, who had served our house for 30 years, knelt beside the fallen creature and examined the restraints still hanging from its foreleg. She said nothing, but I saw her jaw tighten as she studied the cut leather, and I understood, even from a distance, that those restraints had not simply failed, they had been cut. I did not say this aloud, not yet. In my father's court, an accusation spoken too soon was a weapon that could be turned back on the one who spoke it, and I had not survived 23 years among these politics by acting on instinct alone. Instead, I watched Vantor's face as he offered Daniel a bow of practiced courtesy, and I watched Daniel return it with the same mild, unreadable calm he had worn since the day we met. "A fortunate escape," Vantor said smoothly. "The court is grateful you were not harmed." "Fortunate indeed," Daniel replied, and if there was anything sharp hidden beneath those two words, I could not find it. He turned to me then, offering his arm as though we had simply finished an ordinary walk through the gardens, rather than watched a trained killer fall dead at his feet. "Shall we return to the hall, my lady? I believe the excitement has spoiled everyone's appetite for the rest of the hunt." I took his arm because refusing it in front of the entire court would have raised more questions than I was ready to answer. As we walked, I studied the line of his shoulders, the easy rhythm of his steps, searching for some sign of the man who had moved like a striking blade only minutes before. I found nothing. He had folded that version of himself away as completely as he had folded away the weapon at his side, and I began to wonder, with a discomfort I did not enjoy, how many other things my husband had been folding away from me since the very first day. I filed that anger away in my memory, the way I had learned to file away every strange detail at my father's court, because in a place built on politics and old grudges, nothing strange ever stayed unimportant for long. For the first time since our binding ceremony, I found myself studying my husband as though I had never truly seen him before. And for the first time, I understood that I had made a terrible mistake in assuming I knew exactly what kind of man I had married. A fist pounded on my chamber door well past midnight, hard enough to rattle the frame. I was already awake, still turning the day's events over in my mind, and I crossed the room before the second knock landed. Orissa stood in the corridor, her face pale under the torchlight, her hand still raised. "The handler is dead," she said, without any of the formal greeting she usually offered. "The one responsible for the Lurask's restraints, found in his cell an hour ago. His throat was cut from behind. Whoever did it knew the guard rotation to the minute." I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, though I did not move. A dead handler meant a silenced witness. It meant someone had been afraid of what he might say if questioned properly, and it meant that whoever arranged the Lurask's escape was still inside these walls, still close enough to reach a guarded cell without being seen. "Does my father know?" I asked. "He has been told. He asks that you remain in your chambers until the grounds have been searched." Orissa hesitated, glancing past me into the darkened room. "Your husband is not here." That single sentence did more to wake me than the pounding on my door had managed. I stepped past her into the corridor without bothering to summon an attendant, moving quickly toward the east wing where Daniel's private study stood beside our shared chambers. The torches along the hallway burned low, throwing long shapes against the stone, and every shadow seemed, for the first time in my life inside this house, like something that might be watching me back. I found him in the study, already dressed, already awake, standing over a small table where he had laid out a folded map of the estate grounds. He did not startle when I entered. He barely looked up. "You heard about the handler," I said. It was not a question. "I did." He straightened, and in the low light his expression was harder to read than it had been in the clearing that afternoon. Whoever silenced him moved quickly. "That tells me they were afraid of exactly one thing, that he would name who paid him to cut those restraints." "How do you already know he was paid?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, weighing something behind those pale eyes. "Because trained beasts do not slip their chains by accident, Saraith. Someone cut the restraints deliberately, timed the release to the exact moment I would be standing alone at the edge of the field, and made sure no guard was close enough to help in time. That is not an accident. That is a plan, executed by someone with detailed knowledge of the hunt's schedule and my usual habits." I crossed the room and studied the map spread across the table. He had marked several points along the estate grounds in careful small symbols I did not recognize, sight lines and distances noted beside each one in a tidy, unfamiliar hand. "You were preparing for this before it happened," I said slowly. "You knew someone might come after you." "I suspected it," he admitted. "I did not know when or how. I hoped I was wrong." "Why would anyone target you at all? You are a diplomat's son attending a ceremonial hunt. You have no political power of your own." Daniel looked at me directly then, and something in his gaze made me feel, for the first time since our binding, as though I was speaking with a stranger who had been wearing my husband's face for 4 months. I am not important because of who I am, Sir Wraith. I am important because of what my death would mean. A human consort killed on Ilvain soil, in full view of the court, during a ceremony meant to celebrate the alliance between our peoples. Whoever arranged tonight was not trying to remove one man. They were trying to break a treaty by making it look like an accident no one could prove. The logic of it settled over me like cold water. Vantor's faction had opposed the alliance from its very first reading. A dead human consort, especially one killed in a way that could be blamed on carelessness rather than conspiracy, would give them exactly the outrage they needed to demand the treaty's dissolution, all without anyone ever having to prove intent. "You should have told me you suspected this," I said, and I heard something sharp creep into my own voice that surprised me. "Would you have believed me?" Daniel asked, not unkindly. "4 months ago, you thought I was too soft to hold a blade dance without embarrassing myself. Telling you I suspected an assassination attempt against a treaty consort would have sounded like the ravings of a frightened man trying to seem important. I judged it wiser to watch, and wait, and be ready if the moment came." I could not argue with him, because he was entirely correct, and the honesty of it stung more than any insult could have. I had spent 4 months looking directly through him, seeing only what I expected to see, and he had spent those same 4 months quietly preparing for a danger I had never once considered real. A sound from the corridor outside cut our conversation short, soft but wrong, the scrape of a boot against stone where no boot should have been at this hour. Daniel's head turned toward it before I even registered what I had heard, and in one motion he stepped between me and the study door, his hand already moving to the hidden place at his side where the plain blade waited. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. I did not stay behind him. My people are not built to hide behind anyone, and every instinct trained into me since childhood pushed me forward rather than back. I reached for the ceremonial dagger I kept at my own hip, more decoration than weapon, but sharp enough to matter if it came to that. The door swung open before either of us reached it, and 2 figures stepped through, dressed in the dark gray uniforms of palace guards, hoods drawn low over their faces. Something about the way they moved was wrong. Too smooth, too coordinated, nothing like the guards who patrolled these halls every night of my life. Real palace guards announced themselves. These 2 had come to be quiet. The first one lunged for Daniel with a short blade already drawn, moving with real training behind the strike, not the clumsy aggression of a common thief. Daniel did not retreat. He turned his body sideways, let the blade pass close enough that I heard the fabric of his sleeve tear, and answered with a strike of his own that ended the confrontation before I had even finished drawing my dagger fully free. The second figure turned toward me instead, perhaps judging me the easier target, a decision that told me everything I needed to know about how badly they had underestimated both of us. I had trained with a blade since I was old enough to walk, and though my ceremonial dagger was no true weapon of war, I had faced worse odds in the training arena 100 times over. I stepped inside the reach of the incoming strike rather than away from it, the way my sparring masters had drilled into me since childhood, and Daniel was there half a heartbeat later, finishing what I had started before either of us was harmed. When it was over, both intruders lay still on the study floor, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any I had known in this house before. Daniel knelt beside the nearer one and pulled back the hood, revealing a face I did not recognize, though the fine stitching on the collar of his uniform told a story of its own. It was not palace-issued cloth. It was a careful, expensive imitation, made to pass a casual glance but not a close one. Someone spent real resources dressing these 2 to look like our own guards, Daniel said quietly, studying the collar. That takes planning, and access to information most outsiders would never have. Whoever arranged tonight has allies inside these walls, Sir Wraith, possibly close to your father's own council. I thought immediately of Counselor Vantor's face at the hunting grounds, the flicker of something calculating behind his practiced courtesy, the anger in his voice when he should have felt only relief. I did not say his name aloud yet. Naming a member of my father's council without proof was a dangerous thing, even for me, even with the evidence of 2 bodies on the study floor between us. "Who taught you to fight like this?" I asked instead, because it was the question I could not stop returning to, more urgent now than any political calculation. "You told me on the day we met that you were good at nothing worth mentioning." Something shifted behind Daniel's eyes, a door opening just slightly on a room he had kept closed for a very long time. "I told you what I believed you needed to hear," he said, "not what was true. I am sorry for that, Saraith. I think it is time I told you the rest." Outside, the corridor had filled with the sound of running footsteps and raised voices as the rest of the household guard finally arrived, far too late to matter, drawn by noise none of them had managed to prevent. Orissa pushed through them first, sword already drawn, and stopped short at the sight of the 2 fallen figures on the study floor. Her eyes moved from them to me, to Daniel, and back again, and I watched her expression shift from alarm to something closer to disbelief. "My lady," she said carefully, "are you harmed?" "No," I said, and found that it was true. My hands were steady, though my heart still beat harder than it should have. "They came for my husband. We were faster than they expected." Orissa knelt beside the nearest body and repeated the same careful examination she had performed at the hunting grounds hours earlier, running her fingers along the false stitching on the collar, the weight of the blade still loose in the intruder's hand. She said nothing for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped low enough that only Daniel and I could hear it clearly. "These are not the palace guard's blades," she said. "The palace armory issues a mark on every weapon. These carry none. Whoever sent them wanted this to look like an internal matter, something your father's own household would have to answer for quietly, without involving outside investigators." "Send word to my father," I told her. "He should hear this from me directly, before anyone has time to shape the story into something more convenient." Orissa nodded once and turned to relay instructions to the guards crowding the corridor behind her, ordering the bodies moved and the study sealed until my father's own investigators could examine it undisturbed. The household came alive around us in the way it always did during a crisis, controlled and efficient on the surface, though I could see the uncertainty in every face that passed the study door. No one in this house had expected violence to reach this far inside our own walls, and no one, least of all me, had expected the one member of our household equipped to answer it would be the quiet human consort everyone had spent 4 months underestimating. I sent word to my father myself, choosing my words carefully, aware that whatever I wrote tonight would shape how the entire court understood these events by morning. I did not name Vantor. Not yet. Suspicion was not proof, and a false accusation against a sitting counselor, however justified it felt in that moment, could do as much damage to the treaty as the attack itself. I asked instead for an investigation, for the collars and blades to be examined by hands loyal only to my father, and for extra guards to be posted at both the study and our shared chambers until the matter was resolved. By the time the corridor finally quieted and the last of the guards withdrew to their posts outside, the night had turned toward morning, gray light beginning to creep along the edges of the eastern windows. Daniel rose to his feet and looked at me with an expression I had never seen him wear before, something tired and old, and far heavier than the calm politeness he had shown the entire court for 4 straight months. "There is a great deal about my people you were never told," he said quietly. "I think, after tonight, you have earned the right to hear it properly." "Then tell me," I said. "All of it. No more careful half-truths dressed up as modesty." He glanced toward the sealed door, toward the corridor where guards still moved with quiet urgency, and something in his shoulders eased slightly, as though a weight he had carried alone for 4 months had finally found somewhere else to rest. "Not here," he said. "Not tonight, while the household is still awake and listening at every door. Tomorrow, when the estate is quiet again, I will tell you everything about where I come from, and why a man your people believed was too soft to hold a blade dance was the only person in that clearing today capable of stopping what nearly happened." I studied his face in the gray morning light, searching for the stranger I had glimpsed in the study, only an hour earlier, the one who moved without hesitation and struck without wasted motion. He was folding himself away again, tucking that version of himself back beneath the same calm exterior he had worn since our very first meeting, and for the first time I understood that this folding away was not weakness or deception born of malice. It was a habit built by necessity, the careful discipline of a man who had learned, somewhere in his past, that revealing his full strength too quickly could be as dangerous as having none at all. Tomorrow, then, I agreed. But Daniel, I want you to understand something before you decide how much of the truth I have earned. I do not frighten easily, and I do not forgive easily either, when someone I trusted has kept something this large hidden from me. I know, he said quietly, and for the first time since our binding ceremony, I believed he meant exactly what he said. That is precisely why I intend to tell you everything. My hands were not steady when I sat down across from her the next evening, though I made certain she never saw them shake. I had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in the years since I first accepted this posting, imagining every version of how it might go wrong, and none of those imagined versions had ever included 2 bodies on a study floor and a wife who had fought at my side without a single moment of hesitation. I am not a diplomat's soft, unremarkable son. I never was. That story was written for me before I ever set foot on Ilvain soil, crafted carefully by people far above my pay grade, who understood something the wider galaxy had not yet been allowed to learn about my species. Earth was not always the quiet, technologically modest world the other star-faring peoples believed it to be. 3 generations before I was born, we were nearly destroyed. A hostile fleet arrived without warning, drawn by resources we did not know we possessed, and for 11 brutal years, humanity fought a war we were never supposed to survive. We had no orbital shipyards worth the name, no fleets capable of matching what came for us. What we had instead was every soldier, every engineer, every ordinary person willing to keep fighting long after the odds said we should have surrendered. We survived that war, but survival came at a cost that reshaped everything about how my people prepared for the future. Our militaries rebuilt themselves around a single hard lesson. Technology alone had not saved us. Discipline, adaptability, and a willingness to close the distance and finish a fight with our own hands had saved us, when our ships and our satellites had failed. Every doctrine written afterward carried that lesson at its core. We stopped chasing the kind of technological spectacle that other species use to measure strength, and we built instead a generation of soldiers trained to be effective with almost nothing, because nothing was very nearly all we had ever had. When Earth finally rejoined the wider galactic community, our leaders made a deliberate choice. We would not announce what that war had built inside us. Let the other powers see modest ships, cautious diplomacy, and unremarkable ambassadors' sons who preferred tea to blade dances. Let them underestimate us, the way they always seemed inclined to underestimate anything smaller and quieter than themselves. It was not pride that kept us silent. It was survival. A galaxy full of empires who valued strength above all else would treat a truly capable Earth as a threat to be contained rather than a partner to be trusted, and my people had already paid too high a price once to risk inviting that kind of attention again. I was recruited into that quiet tradition at 19, trained by men and women who had themselves been trained by survivors of the old war, taught to fight the way my grandfather's generation had been forced to fight when nothing else remained. By the time I was selected for this posting, I had spent more years in close combat training than in any classroom, though very few people beyond a small circle back home knew that about me at all. I was sent to Ilvain specifically because of what I could do, not despite it. When the treaty negotiations began, my superiors understood exactly what kind of court I would be marrying into. A warrior culture built on strength and scars, where any hint of weakness in a treaty consort would be treated as an open invitation for exactly the kind of plot that had nearly killed me in that clearing. They needed someone who could survive quietly beside the future ruler of the Ilvain Dominion, without ever revealing what he was capable of, someone who could serve as insurance against precisely the kind of accident that occurred during the hunt, without ever forcing our two governments into an open confrontation neither side wanted. I did not choose to keep this from Saraith out of any desire to deceive her for its own sake. I chose it because I did not yet know what kind of woman she was, and revealing something this large to the wrong person, even a wife bound to me by treaty, could have ended badly for both our peoples. I watched her for 4 months before I understood something I had not expected to learn at all. She was not the cold, distant political figure I had been warned to expect. She was sharp, and she was fair, and beneath the formal distance every noble in that court wore like armor. She carried a genuine concern for the people under her family's protection that I had not seen described in any briefing document. I found myself, somewhere in those 4 quiet months, wishing our marriage was something more than a treaty obligation neither of us had chosen freely. That wish complicated everything about the mission I had been sent here to complete, because a man who has begun to care for the person beside him makes different choices than a man who sees her only as an assignment. I had told myself, more than once, that I would keep my distance, that feelings had no place in a posting built entirely around secrecy and careful restraint. Watching her fight at my side in that study, meeting the attack without a single moment of fear, had made keeping that distance considerably harder than I expected. I remembered, as I sat there, the last time I had drawn a blade in earnest before the clearing yesterday. It was during my final training exercise on Earth, 5 years earlier, in a mountain range chosen specifically because it resembled almost nothing a modern soldier would expect to fight in. My instructor, a quiet, gray-haired veteran named Colonel Grant who had lost most of his hearing in the old war, stood at the edge of that exercise and told us something I had never forgotten. He said that the galaxy would always have bigger ships and louder weapons than we did, and that the day we started believing size and noise were the same thing as strength was the day we would lose everything the old war had taught us to protect. Strength, he said, was patience wearing a calm face, waiting for the one moment when it mattered, and spending every other moment convincing your enemies you had none. I had carried that lesson with me across every quiet dinner, every ceremonial function, every evening spent walking Ilvain's gardens alone, while nobles who considered themselves warriors looked past me without a second glance. It had been easier than I expected, at first, to be underestimated. It became harder, month after month, as I found myself wanting Saraith in particular to see past the calm face I wore for everyone else. I told myself, more than once, that wanting such a thing was a distraction from the posting I had been sent here to complete. Sitting across from her now, watching her study me with an intensity that had not existed between us before last night, I understood that the distraction had already taken root somewhere I could no longer easily pull it out. Now I sat across from her, watching the fire in her private chambers throw shifting light across a face that had studied me all night, with an intensity I had never seen her direct at anyone, and I understood that the moment for careful half-truths had finally passed. My people were nearly destroyed once, I began, by an enemy who believed us too small and too primitive to matter. We survived by becoming something that enemy never expected, and we have spent every year since making certain the rest of the galaxy never learns exactly what that means. I told her everything, the old war, the doctrine built from its ashes, the quiet tradition of consorts and diplomats trained far beyond what their gentle reputations suggested. I told her why I had been chosen for this posting, and I told her, more carefully than anything else, what I had begun to feel for her somewhere in the 4 months I had spent pretending to be an ordinary man. Saraith listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable in the firelight, and when I finally finished speaking, the silence that followed felt longer than the entire conversation that had preceded it. She rose from her chair and walked slowly toward the window, looking out over the dark gardens where, only hours earlier, guards had finally begun to relax their vigilance after a night no one in this house would soon forget. My father chose this alliance because he believed it would strengthen our house against rivals like Vantor, she said, not turning to face me. He never imagined the alliance itself would need protecting from the very people meant to celebrate it. Alliances built purely on paper rarely survive contact with people determined to break them, I said. That is precisely why my superiors insisted on sending someone capable of more than signing documents and attending ceremonies. A treaty is only as strong as the willingness of both sides to defend it when it is tested, and I suspect, after last night, that Vantor intends to test it a great deal further before he is finished. She turned back to face me, and something in her expression had shifted from the careful distance of the past 4 months into something closer to the fierce, focused attention she must have shown her own sparring masters as a girl. Then we should not wait for his next attempt to catch us unprepared the way the Lorasque nearly did, she said. You have spent 4 months learning the shape of my father's court from the outside. I have spent my entire life learning it from within. Between the two of us, Daniel, I do not believe Vantor understands what he has actually chosen to fight. You have been protecting my house since the day you arrived, she said finally, and I spent 4 months believing I had married the least useful man at my father's court. I needed you to believe that, I admitted, for your safety and mine, and for the sake of the treaty neither of us chose. I am sorry it took an assassination attempt to earn your trust honestly. She was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not quite name, something between anger and relief, and a curiosity that had not existed between us in all our 4 months of careful distance. Counselor Vantor will not stop with one failed attempt, she said finally, and I heard the shift in her voice, the warrior setting aside the wounded wife to focus on the danger still circling us both. A man who arranges a beast's escape and silences a witness within the same night will not simply accept defeat because his first plan failed. No, I agreed. He will not, which means we need to decide, tonight, exactly how we intend to be ready for whatever he tries next. 3 days later, my father announced a formal ceremony to honor the treaty that bound our two peoples, timed deliberately to answer every whisper spreading through the court since the night of the attack. He meant it as a public statement of confidence, a way of telling every noble house watching that nothing about the alliance had weakened. I understood immediately, the moment the announcement was made, that he had handed Counselor Vantor exactly the opportunity he needed. A formal ceremony required a formal guard, drawn not from my father's usual household soldiers, but from a rotating honor detail, assembled from several noble houses as a gesture of shared trust across the court. It was tradition older than my grandmother's reign, and it meant that on the night of the ceremony, dozens of armed men and women, I did not personally know, would stand within arm's reach of both my husband and myself, wearing ceremonial armor that concealed their faces behind traditional honor masks. Daniel noticed the vulnerability before I finished explaining the tradition to him. Anyone wishing to place armed operatives close enough to strike would need only a handful of positions within that honor detail, he said, studying the ceremonial hall's floor plan we had spread across his study table. A masked face and borrowed armor would let them stand within a sword's length of us both, without a single guard questioning their presence. The honor detail is chosen by lottery among the noble houses, I said. It would take considerable influence to guarantee particular names were selected. Vantor sits on the council that oversees that lottery, Daniel said quietly, and I felt the pieces settle into place with an unpleasant certainty. We did not go to my father with mere suspicion. We went to Arissa instead, quietly, and asked her to review the honor detail's final roster herself before the ceremony began. She found what we expected to find: 4 names added to the list only 2 days earlier, replacing 4 honor guards who had served in that same role for over a decade without incident, each replacement approved by a single signature belonging to Counselor Vantor himself. My father, once shown the evidence, wished to cancel the ceremony entirely and arrest Vantor on the spot. I argued against it, and Daniel supported me, though I could see the argument cost him something to make. Arresting a sitting counselor without absolute proof of intent would tear the court apart along old factional lines regardless of guilt, and worse, it would hand Vantor's remaining allies a grievance to rally around for years afterward. What we needed instead was proof, so complete that no faction in the court could question it once revealed, and the safest way to gather that proof was to let the ceremony proceed exactly as Vantor expected, with every advantage on our side that his allies did not know we possessed. Those 3 nights of training taught me more about my husband than 4 months of shared meals ever had. We met in a private courtyard behind our chambers, away from the eyes of the household staff, and Daniel showed me movements unlike anything my sparring masters had ever demonstrated. He did not teach the wide decorative strikes my people favored in the arena, the kind meant to be admired by a watching crowd as much as they were meant to win a duel. He taught economy instead, the smallest possible motion capable of ending a confrontation, footwork built around redirecting an opponent's own strength rather than meeting it directly. "Your people fight to be seen fighting well," he told me on the second night, correcting the angle of my wrist with a gentle, precise touch. "My people learned to fight when there was no one left to watch and no time to waste on anything decorative. Every motion has to earn its place, or it gets you killed." I found myself, during those quiet hours in the courtyard, watching him with something that had nothing to do with political duty at all. He was patient in a way I had not expected, correcting my mistakes without the condescension I had grown used to from instructors who assumed a princess required gentler handling than other students. He treated me as an equal capable of real improvement, and something about that treatment settled into me more deeply than I expected it to. On the 3rd night, after we had finished a final round of drills, he caught my hand as I turned to leave and held it a moment longer than necessary. "Saraith," he said, and something careful in his voice made me stop and look at him properly. "Whatever happens tomorrow night, I want you to know that none of what I have told you these past few days was part of any assignment. I am telling you because I want you to know it, not because my superiors require it of me." I did not have a ready answer for him then, caught between the careful distance I had maintained since our binding and something warmer that had been growing quietly beneath it since the night of the first attack. I only nodded and let my hand remain in his a moment longer before the practical business of preparing for the ceremony pulled us both back toward more urgent matters. The night of the ceremony arrived clear and cold, torches lining the great hall in long, flickering rows. Nobles from every house gathered beneath banners that had flown over this court for generations. I stood beside Daniel, near the ceremonial dais, dressed in the formal robes my station required, while around the hall's edges the honor detail stood at careful, motionless attention behind their traditional masks. I counted the 4 replacement guards within the first few minutes, exactly where Orissa's roster had placed them, spaced evenly around the hall in positions that would let each one reach the dais within a handful of steps. Daniel had counted them as well. I could tell from the careful, unhurried way his gaze moved across the room, cataloging distances and angles the way he must have been trained to do since he was 19 years old. The ceremony proceeded through its early stages exactly as tradition demanded, my father speaking of unity and shared strength before the assembled houses, and I felt the tension in the hall build the way pressure builds before a mountain storm, invisible until the moment it finally breaks. It broke when my father called Daniel and me forward to renew our binding vows before the entire court, the traditional final act of the ceremony, and the same moment that would place us both, unguarded by anything but ceremonial robes, directly beside all 4 replacement guards at once. They moved together, which was their first mistake. Real assassins working independently might have staggered their approach, but these 4 had clearly rehearsed a single coordinated strike meant to overwhelm any resistance before it could properly form. 2 moved toward Daniel, 2 toward me, blades sliding free from beneath ceremonial robes that had concealed them through the entire evening. I had spent 3 days training beside Daniel in a way no consort of my house had ever trained with her husband before, learning to move the way he moved, to strike with the same economy and patience he had shown in that first clearing. When the nearest guard lunged for me, I did not retreat the way tradition and instinct both suggested. I stepped inside the strike, exactly as Daniel had drilled into me over those 3 quiet nights, and turned the guard's own momentum against the angle of his attack. My ceremonial dagger, sharpened that very morning at my own quiet insistence, found its mark before he recovered his balance. Beside me, Daniel moved with the same calm efficiency I had watched him use against the Larask, meeting both attackers directed at him without a single wasted motion, ending each confrontation before the gathered court had fully processed what was happening at all. The great hall erupted into chaos, nobles scattering from the dais, my father's true guards finally surging forward now that the threat had revealed itself openly, but the fighting itself was already finished by the time they arrived. 4 masked figures lay defeated on the ceremonial floor, and the entire court stood witness to exactly how badly they had underestimated both the human consort they had dismissed as harmless and the princess they had assumed needed protecting. In the ringing silence that followed, my father's voice cut through the hall, cold with a fury I had rarely heard him direct at anyone. "Remove their masks," he commanded, and Orissa moved forward to obey. The faces beneath were unfamiliar to me, hired hands rather than true nobles, but the fine stitching on their borrowed ceremonial armor matched exactly the imitation cloth Daniel had identified on the night of the first attack. And in the pocket of the nearest attacker, tucked away as carelessly as a man might tuck away something he never expected anyone to find, Orissa discovered a folded note bearing instructions written in a careful, familiar hand that half the council recognized immediately as belonging to Counselor Vantor himself. I turned to look at him across the hall, standing frozen among the scattering nobles with an expression that had finally abandoned every trace of practiced courtesy. For just a moment, before the guards moved to seize him, our eyes met, and I saw in his face the particular fear of a man who has just watched his entire careful plan collapse in front of the one audience he could never afford to lose. Beside me, Daniel lowered his blade and reached for my hand, and I found that my fingers were steadier than they had any right to be after everything that had just happened. "It is over," he said quietly, though I could hear beneath the calm of his voice something that had not been there before tonight, something warmer than careful diplomatic distance. "Not yet," I said, watching the guards drag Vantor forward to face my father's judgment. "But it will be, very soon." My father stood from his seat at the head of the hall, and the noise of the scattering court fell silent almost immediately, every noble house present understanding that whatever happened next would be remembered for generations. Vantor stood between 2 guards, his fine robes disheveled from the struggle, the folded note still held in Orissa's outstretched hand, for the entire court to see. "You will explain this," my father said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the great hall, "or you will be stripped of your seat on this council before the sun rises." Vantor's composure, so carefully maintained across every court appearance I had ever witnessed, finally cracked entirely. "The alliance was a mistake from its first signing," he said, his voice rising with a bitterness he no longer bothered to hide. "1,000 years of ill-veined strength, bound to a species so eager to hide its own weakness that even its consort pretended to be nothing more than a soft, harmless diplomat. I did what any loyal member of this council should have considered. I tried to save this house from a bond that would have weakened it for generations. You tried to murder a treaty consort inside my own hall," my father said, "and when that failed, you tried again before the eyes of every noble house in this dominion. Whatever you believed you were protecting, Vantor, you have instead handed every witness in this room undeniable proof of exactly the kind of dishonor this council will not tolerate." I watched the other noble houses in the hall, searching their faces for any sign of sympathy toward Vantor's cause, and found instead a wall of cold, unified disapproval. Whatever quiet resentment toward the alliance had existed among the older families, none of them were willing to be associated with attempted murder carried out through hired hands and forged documents. Vantor had believed his cause important enough to justify violence, and in doing so, he had destroyed whatever legitimate argument his faction might once have made through honest debate. The guards led him from the hall while my father addressed the remaining court, his voice steady and deliberate, shaping the story of that night into something the entire Dominion would understand clearly by morning. A counselor had conspired against the crown and against the treaty binding our 2 peoples, and that conspiracy had been defeated not despite the human consort everyone had underestimated, but specifically because of the very skills he had spent 4 months concealing for exactly this purpose. I felt the weight of dozens of eyes shift toward Daniel then, nobles who had dismissed him as harmless furniture only days earlier, now studying him with an entirely different kind of attention, part respect and part wary reassessment. He bore their scrutiny with the same calm patience he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, offering nothing more than a small, formal bow toward my father before turning back to me. "Are you unharmed?" he asked quietly, echoing almost exactly the question he had asked me in the clearing days earlier, though everything about the way he asked it now felt different. "I am," I said, "though I suspect neither of us will be considered ordinary by this court ever again." "No," he agreed, and for the first time since I had known him, something like a genuine smile crossed his face. "I suppose we will not." Vantor's arrest should have ended the matter entirely, but 3 nights later Orissa woke me again, with news that made my stomach turn cold before she finished speaking. A guard assigned to Vantor's holding cell had been discovered unconscious at his post, his keys missing, and the cell itself standing empty. Whoever remained loyal to Vantor's cause had moved quickly to free him, rather than risk what he might reveal under formal questioning, and now a disgraced counselor, with nothing left to lose, was somewhere within the estate grounds, or worse, already beyond them. I found Daniel already awake when I reached our chambers, dressed and alert as though he had been expecting exactly this news. A cornered man who still believes his cause was righteous is more dangerous than one who has accepted defeat, he said, pulling on his boots with quick, efficient movements. Vantor will not simply flee. He still believes he can salvage something from this, and men like that tend to aim for the one target that would make their failure look like a victory instead. "My father," I said, understanding immediately. We reached my father's private wing to find the corridor guards already alert, alarms having been raised the moment the escaped counselor's absence was confirmed, but Daniel moved past them with a focused urgency that told me he suspected something the household guards had not yet considered. He led us not toward my father's main chambers, heavily guarded and unlikely to be Vantor's actual target, but toward a smaller side passage that connected to the private study where my father reviewed council business late into most nights, a room with only a single guard posted, and a door that had, I now remembered uneasily, been installed generations ago with a hidden servant's passage few outside the family knew still existed. We found Vantor already inside that passage, a blade in hand, moving with the desperate haste of a man who understood this was his last possible chance to change how history would remember him. My father stood at his study desk, unarmed, having only just noticed the intrusion, and for one terrible moment I believed we would not reach him in time. Daniel moved faster than I had ever seen him move, faster even than the strike that had felled the Lorisk in that first clearing, closing the distance across the study before Vantor completed his approach toward my father. There was no lengthy confrontation, no exchange of words or accusations, only the same brutal economy of motion I had watched him demonstrate twice before, ending the threat before it ever reached the man it had been aimed at. Vantor fell to the study floor, defeated and disarmed rather than killed, and in the sudden silence that followed I heard my father's ragged breathing as he steadied himself against his own desk, understanding, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, exactly how close he had come to losing everything in his own private study. Orissa arrived moments later with a full detail of guards, having followed the same instinct that had led us to the hidden passage, and together we secured Vantor properly this time, binding him with restraints strong enough that no ally still loyal to his cause would find a second chance to free him. My father sat down heavily in his chair, and for the first time in my life I saw genuine fear pass across his face, not for himself, but for the daughter and the son by marriage who had reached him only moments before it would have been too late. "How did you know to look here?" my father asked Daniel, once the guards had removed Vantor from the study, rather than searching the main corridors with the rest of the household. "A desperate man does not run toward heavily guarded doors," Daniel said. He looks for the quiet paths no one thinks to watch closely. I studied the estate's original architecture when I first arrived here, General. Out of simple caution, I did not expect that knowledge would matter so directly, so soon. You saved my life, my father said quietly, looking at Daniel with an expression I had never seen him wear toward anyone, something between gratitude and genuine astonishment. A man my own council considered too soft to matter. I was never as soft as your council believed, General, Daniel said, helping the guards secure Vantor before turning back to face my father properly. I apologize for the deception. It was necessary until it no longer served either of our peoples to maintain it. My father studied him for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes, an old warrior recalculating everything he had assumed about the alliance his daughter had been bound into. The Ilvain Dominion does not forget a debt of this size, he said finally. Whatever you require, Daniel Ashford, you have only to ask. I require nothing beyond what I already have, Daniel said, glancing toward me with an expression that made my breath catch slightly in my chest. A wife I have come to respect a great deal more than I expected to, and a treaty that I believe, after tonight, stands stronger than it has at any point since it was first signed. Vantor's formal trial took place 3 weeks later, before the full assembly of noble houses, and I will not describe every detail of the proceedings, only the parts that mattered most to what came after. His advocates tried at first to argue that his actions had sprung from misguided loyalty rather than true malice, that a counselor devoted to his people's ancient strength could not be judged by the same standard as a common conspirator. That argument collapsed entirely once Orissa presented the full account of the second escape attempt, the hidden passage, and the blade he had carried toward my unarmed father with every intention of using it. No amount of old loyalty could excuse an attack aimed directly at the ruler he claimed to be protecting the Dominion's honor by opposing. Even the oldest families in attendance, men and women who had privately shared some of Vantor's doubts about the alliance when it was first announced, distanced themselves publicly and without hesitation once the full weight of the evidence was read aloud. Whatever quiet resentment toward humans had existed in certain corners of the court, none of it survived contact with the plain fact that Vantor had tried twice to murder members of his own ruling house to satisfy it. He was stripped of his council seat and his family's ancestral holdings, exiled to the distant provinces where his voice would trouble the capital no further, and the treaty he had spent months trying to destroy emerged from the entire affair more firmly established than my father's original advisors had ever dared hope. A representative from Daniel's own government arrived several days after the trial concluded, a tall, weathered man introduced to the court simply as Ambassador Colton, who requested a private audience with my father before departing again only 2 days later. I was not present for that conversation, but Daniel told me afterward that Colton had come primarily to assess whether the exposure of his true capabilities had damaged the quiet arrangement his people had maintained for generations. He returned to his ship satisfied, apparently, that an alliance strengthened by proven trust was worth considerably more than a secret preserved through continued distance, though Daniel suspected that lesson would take years to fully settle among the more cautious voices back on Earth. I stood before the assembled court on the final day of the trial and spoke words I had not planned in advance, though they came easily enough once I began. I told them that I had married a man I believed to be ordinary, and that I had been wrong in nearly every assumption I carried into that marriage. I told them that true strength rarely announced itself loudly, that the quietest members of any court often carried the deepest capabilities, and that my own house had nearly paid a terrible price for underestimating exactly the kind of man history would remember as having saved it twice. I did not choose this marriage, I told them, and I felt Daniel's presence beside me, though I did not look at him directly while I spoke. But I choose, now, to see the man I was given clearly, and to stand beside him as an equal rather than a stranger sharing his house out of political necessity. The court's reaction to that declaration mattered less to me than I expected it to. What mattered was the quiet conversation Daniel and I shared later that same evening, alone in our private chambers, free at last from the careful performances both of us had maintained for 4 long months at the very beginning of our marriage. "I owe you a proper explanation," he said, settling into the chair across from mine. "About everything I could not tell you before tonight's trial made certain kind of secrecy unnecessary." He told me more that evening than he had shared even during our first long conversation after the assassination attempt. He told me about a world called Earth in more detail than any diplomat's briefing had ever offered my father's court, about cities rebuilt from the ashes of a war that had nearly ended his entire species, about a culture that valued quiet competence over loud displays of strength precisely because loud displays had never been enough to save them when it truly mattered. He told me about his family, about a mother who worried every day he was away on this posting, about a training instructor named Colonel Grant who had taught him that patience wearing a calm face was the truest form of strength a person could carry. I listened to all of it without interruption, understanding slowly that the man across from me had spent his entire adult life mastering the discipline of appearing to be less than he was, not out of arrogance or deception for its own sake, but because his people had learned, at tremendous cost, that revealing true strength too early could invite the very destruction they had barely survived once already. "Do your people intend to remain hidden like this forever?" I asked him, "pretending to be smaller than you are, even to allies who have proven themselves trustworthy?" "I do not know," he admitted. "That decision belongs to people with far more authority than I carry. But I know that tonight, sitting here with you, I no longer wish to hide anything from the person I share my life with. Whatever my superiors decide about the wider galaxy, Saraith, I have already decided what I want to be, honestly, with you." I reached across the space between our chairs and took his hand, the same hand that had drawn a blade twice now, to protect a house that had never truly earned his loyalty through anything beyond a treaty neither of us had chosen freely. He held it gently, the way he had held it in the training courtyard on our third quiet night together, and I found myself thinking that whatever political necessity had first bound us together, something entirely different held us together now. In the weeks that followed, the court's perception of my husband transformed completely. Nobles who had once looked past him without a second glance now studied him with careful, calculated respect, understanding that the quiet human consort walking the estate gardens each evening carried capabilities that could shift the balance of an entire dominion if provoked. My father's advisors began referring to the alliance not as a convenient arrangement with a lesser species, but as a partnership between two peoples whose true strengths had both been badly underestimated by everyone watching from outside. Daniel never grew boastful about the reputation that followed him now. He remained exactly as he had always been, quiet in company, careful with his words, patient with everyone who approached him seeking either friendship or information. The difference now was that I understood precisely what that quiet patience concealed, and I no longer mistook it for weakness the way I had on the day we first met. I found him one evening, several months after Vantor's trial had concluded, sitting alone in the same courtyard where he had once taught me to fight, carefully cleaning the plain, unadorned blade he still carried everywhere, though he no longer bothered hiding it beneath his robes the way he once had. I watched him from the doorway for a long moment before he noticed me, studying the careful, familiar motion of his hands as he wiped the blade clean and returned it to its sheath. "You could carry something finer now," I told him, settling beside him on the courtyard bench. "The court would expect a weapon worthy of the man who saved my father's life. I am not particularly interested in what the court expects of me anymore," he said, smiling slightly as he set the sheathed blade aside. "This one has served me well enough. I see no reason to trade it for something more decorative, simply because everyone finally knows what it is capable of." I thought, sitting there beside him in the quiet evening light, of the woman I had been 4 months into our marriage, certain I had been given the least remarkable man in my father's entire court. That woman had been wrong about nearly everything that mattered, and I found, watching Daniel set his blade aside and reach for my hand instead, that I did not regret a single moment of learning exactly how wrong I had been. The gardens around us had grown quiet with evening, the kind of stillness that only settles over an estate once every guard has finally relaxed, and every threat has finally passed. I thought of the young woman I had been on the day of our binding ceremony, standing across from a soft-spoken stranger, and feeling nothing more than mild disappointment at the match my father's advisors had arranged for me. That woman could not have imagined the 4 months of careful distance that would follow, nor the single violent afternoon that would tear that distance apart entirely and reveal, hidden beneath it, someone worth knowing far more deeply than any political arrangement required. "Colonel Grant would be proud of you, I think," I said, remembering the instructor Daniel had described to me weeks earlier, the quiet man who had taught him that true strength wore a calm face and revealed itself only when it truly mattered. "He would tell me I still have a great deal to learn," Daniel said, laughing softly for the first time I could remember since our binding. "He was never an easy man to satisfy, but I believe he would approve of the choice I made, staying honest with you rather than continuing to hide behind the mission I was given." "And what will your superiors say?" I asked, "now that the entire Dominion knows exactly what your people are capable of?" "They will worry, for a while," he admitted. "Old habits built from old wounds are not easily set aside, but I suspect, in time, they will understand what I have already learned firsthand. Trust built honestly, even at the cost of a carefully guarded secret, tends to hold far stronger than distance maintained purely out of fear." I considered that for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky above the courtyard where he had once taught me to fight beside him rather than behind him. Whatever the wider galaxy eventually learned about his people, and whatever careful decisions his government made in the years ahead, I understood that the truth between the two of us had already been settled, tested by fire and blade, and the quiet courage of a man willing to reveal himself fully once distance no longer served either of us. I had been told, on the day of our binding, that I was marrying a diplomat's ordinary son, a gentle addition to a political arrangement that would strengthen my father's house without demanding anything difficult of either of us. I had believed that story completely, right up until the moment he drew his blade in that clearing and revealed, in a single motion, everything the entire galaxy had been trained to overlook about his quiet, unremarkable species. I would not have traded him, in the end, for any warrior my father's court could have offered me instead. Whatever the wider galaxy believed about his people, I knew now exactly what kind of man I had married, and I intended to spend the rest of my life standing beside him, not as a stranger bound by treaty, but as an equal who had finally learned to see him clearly.